J'ai le plaisir de présenter Danuta Nitecki, donc qui est dean de la bibliothèque de l'université de Drexler, près de Philadelphie. Et donc j'ai eu l'occasion de découvrir les publications de Danuta. Et donc l'ENSIV a eu vraiment la gentillesse de faire en sorte de pouvoir l'inviter. Donc je vous recommande de lire les publications. Donc Danuta a notamment publié beaucoup sur l'évaluation et la notion de valeur en bibliothèque. Donc elle est responsable d'une bibliothèque académique, comme on dit aux États-Unis, c'est-à-dire une bibliothèque universitaire. Elle a plus de 40 ans de métier. Elle a été dans de nombreuses institutions, elle m'a dit. Elle a été enseignante. Et donc elle fait un grand nombre d'études pour défendre un peu le budget et l'existence de sa bibliothèque, parce que, elle me le disait tout à l'heure, voilà, le budget et l'existence même des bibliothèques, vous savez, est remise en cause, et en tout cas des budgets fortement à la baisse aux États-Unis. Donc elle va rendre compte de cette publication. Sinon, j'incite vraiment à aller lire en ligne. Et sinon, petit teaser, une publication au Cercle de la Librairie doit sortir incessamment, en juin ou peut-être en septembre. Et un article très intéressant de Danuta sera traduit sur cette notion d'impact et de comment calculer ce dont parlait Christophe tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire la difficile mesure de l'impact de la fréquentation de la bibliothèque universitaire dans la réussite des étudiants. C'est ce à quoi s'attelle Danuta depuis de nombreuses années.
Merci. So, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today, and a special thanks to Michelle, the translator, for enabling us to have this conversation in spite of my inability to converse in your beautiful language. So with this kind introduction, you know a little bit about me, but now let me know a little bit about you. So please lift your hand if you work in a public library. Okay. Now raise your hand if you're an academic librarian. Okay, and how many of your teachers are students? It's almost even. Very nice. Okay, so now, please raise your hand if you have ever passionately advocated for supporting a library. So finally, raise your hand if you have incorporated data into discussions about the impact of a library. Oh, so I'm glad you're here. So now look around, those who had the hands, and get acquainted, because you'll find then already who has worked with evidence-based advocacy and who might welcome that hand of experience that you've raised. So to continue our introduction to the session, let me next build some common ground around what we think about advocacy and incorporating impact indicators. So to do so, I ask that you use the classic 5-point Likert scale, where 1 equals strongly disagree and 5 equals where 1 equals strongly disagree and 5 equals strongly agree. So in the next 5 slides, I will make a statement about advocacy and ask you to indicate the extent of your agreement or disagreement with it. But to do so, I'd like you to do it with your body stance, as follows. If you strongly disagree, stay seated. If you disagree, stay seated but raise one hand. If you neither agree or disagree, stand up but sort of drop your hands. If you agree, stand and raise one hand, and if you strongly agree, stand enthusiastically with both hands up with great passion. Okay? Got it? All right. First statement. Advocacy is a process to get someone to correct a situation that negatively affects people. So where are you? If you disagree or if you agree? Okay, you can't all be disagreeing. So either you stay seated if you strongly disagree, stay seated with one hand up if you disagree. If you neither agree or disagree, stand up, both hands down. If you agree, stand and raise one hand. And if you strongly agree, there's one, passionately, enthusiastically, both hands up. And do so and stand for a minute. All right, so there's a lot of agreement here. Very good. Now you get it. Second statement. Successful advocates for public library literacy programs ignore children's ideas. Where do you stand? Strongly agree or disagree? Either you're standing, seating with this statement. Seems like you're not sure, standing. Okay, there's some agreement. There's some strong agreement, good agreement. The rest of you disagree. If you don't know, just, okay, we got one who's not decided. All right, this is a tough one, huh? Let's try the third one. Ultimately, students are the most likely to be affected by the changes in an academic library makes to its services and collections. This is your main stakeholder. Again, passionately agree, stand up, or? All right, here you've got, now we've got a group that has a common opinion. Very good. The fourth one. Successful advocacy of the library's contribution to student success requires only the senior faculty members' attention. This one might have a political overtone. Successful advocacy of the library's contribution to student success requires only the senior faculty's opinions. Agreement? So disagreement, you're all strongly disagreeing. You're just staying seated. All right. And finally, using common impact indicators enables librarians to track progress of the library's contribution to student success. We speak the same language. We have some of the same indicators. Be easier to make tracking the success. Strong agreement. The back row, strong agreement. Very good. All right. Well, you might already have this talk. Okay, fellow librarians, relax. My talk will not encourage continuous assessment and intricate evaluations to build good advocacy. Although measurements and metrics may embellish evidence useful in advocacy, a few well-selected impact indicators are important tools to gauge the progress of reaching an advocated change. These also can be integrated into an advocator's succinct talking points to tell the library's story. So my comments borrow heavily from a chapter about use of impact indicators for building advocacy that I wrote last fall for Cécile Tuitu, edited book about library impact assessment and advocacy that should soon be released. I also make a disclaimer that my knowledge is heavily based on experiences among academic libraries within the United States, and I'm not familiar, I'm afraid to say, with activities in France. So I hope my comments may spark your interest to consider multiple perspectives when selecting impact factors for building an advocacy strategy, and that you will add from your experience during our conversations later. So I will address the two main topics today's hosts posed for me. One, how understanding library value for different stakeholders is central to advocacy. And second, with focus on the importance of impact of the library on student success, what are some methods to calculate the importance, and how do data form a basis for academic library advocacy? So let me begin our conversation by making some assumptions first about what advocacy is. Advocacy is a process to get someone to correct a situation that negatively affects people. It is a situational activity. To be effective, it must be customized to the specific situation, requiring change and be relevant to multiple stakeholders. Advocacy is about persuasion and achieving influence through reaching both the heart and the mind. Effective advocacy involves research on the issue, but also the community climate of opinion, and particularly any resistance. To develop a successful advocacy requires selection and implementation of effective strategies and tactics, informed by information concluded from the research. Such a process should be natural for librarians who are experts at finding relevant information, though most librarians are not skilled in the art of developing advocacy. Furthermore, not all good advocacy is based on evidence. Some relies on what people know and believe based on little beyond their own experiences. Advocacy for the library is increasingly viewed for its intended purpose: to influence people, to change the state of libraries as a valued organization that changes people's lives through access to information. To do so requires the case for support to include the impact of the library on improving lives, and cannot rest merely on a cultural assumption that its inherent social goodness is impact enough. The profession is only beginning to understand what advocacy entails and how to effectively use it. An inquiry of what this means will be addressed today around the premise that advocacy is a strategy for engaging stakeholders. The strategy for library advocacy begins with understanding stakeholders' perceived value of the library. So how is understanding a library value for different stakeholders central to advocacy? Our first question. Every unit within an academic institution is increasingly required to contribute to the best value the college or university offers the diverse and growing community of its students. Academic libraries are not freestanding organizations, and within higher education, at least in the United States, their contribution is typically made through enhancing their home institution's provision of public goods, rather than direct revenue streams through tuition, sponsored research, or gifts. There are multiple stakeholders who value the diverse good the good that the academy provides, and in turn who benefit from an effective advocacy effort. Most affected are the people for whom change is advocated. So yes, students are targeted as the primary beneficiary of advocacy for academic libraries. They benefit from enhanced and self-directed learning environments, expert guidance, and ensured access to scholarship. Faculty and other employees who are affected in their work to contribute to these shared objectives through their teaching, research, and service. Similarly, understanding what is important to those with influence to make change is also important to bridge the two important players involved in an advocacy effort, those with influence and those with potential benefit. So in a 2013 paper I published with my colleague Eileen Abels, we described the relationship in terms of the library's contribution through a graphic wheel of value. The outer rim of the core notes various stakeholders, and inside the donut, we identify the major cause of perceived library value held by each stakeholder. So let's look a little closer at this. So for example, our study confirmed that for students, the impact on learning was the major cause of perceived library value. For faculty, it was their productivity, and for administrators, it was financial return on investment. Today, and on different campuses, these root causes of perceived value might not be the same. This wheel, however, suggests the importance to recognize that there are numerous players with diverse perceptions of what change in their lives will benefit from an effective advocacy effort. Whether the library is the advocator or other advocate for the library, the focus of change is on the impact that engagement with the library's services and resources have on the lives of those who benefit from interacting with the library. So let me repeat this. The focus of change for an advocacy effort is the impact the library has on the lives of its clients. The stakeholders help us articulate what that focus of change is through an understanding of their perceived value or measured impact the library's contribution has for them. The time is right for library administrators to consider building advocacy when the demands for library service improvement grow and the ability to redistribute resources are exhausted through routine lobbying for raising money or supporting worthy initiatives. Librarians are challenged to successfully compete in the shared governance culture of higher education that at times has tension between ensuring its mission of providing public good and its necessity to prosper as a business within a market-driven economy. Articulation and focus on impact indicators for where libraries add value can guide development and practice of new skills to design effective advocacy strategies. Library reports of activities and availability of resources are no longer sufficient to affect change in higher education. Accountability now demands evidence of impact. Institutions of higher education look for indicators of contributions to academic success. In the United States, such indicators typically include graduation rate, with established correlations to retention and grade point average. Administrators also seek impact on the university's fiscal situation, measured not in terms of profit, but in terms of return on investment. successful grant funding, donor contributions, and on the overall costs of education, for example. Librarians always faced inadequate funding for the services and resources they wish to provide. In making a case for increased funding, academic library administrators traditionally have reported inputs, such as the budget allocation, size of collection, staffing, and space, and subsequent outputs resulting from their library's operations, such as the provided amount of reference, the instruction or circulation services, and the processed volume of acquisitions, cataloging, or interlibrary loans. These metrics have long been ranked in comparison to other libraries to argue that the library is behind or is better than a peer institution. In either case, the ranked position is often noted as a competitive reason for the parent institution to give strong support. Some institutions of higher education rely on rankings to advocate for growth, tapping pride in reputation. When rankings improve, they imply effective performance. When they decline, they provide opportunity for investment. However, increasingly, as accountability is becoming a cultural expectation within organizations, these input and output metrics are inadequate to inspire advocacy efforts. And I can personally attest to university administrators' reactions to lobbying for added resources in order to improve our rankings of input and output metrics among libraries at our peer institutions. My boss, for example, compliments us on our management effectiveness to accomplish more with less, but he's not moved to use this once very common strategy to increase resources. What is now expected is to demonstrate contribution to the university's impact factors. These are managerial requests for resources, but have not typically been associated with the impact any support of the library has on the people it serves. The long-standing contribution of the library to the public good mission of higher education, as well as for public libraries, has not been challenged, at least in democracies, and few people object to the idea that libraries need to be supported. The need is sacred, and the reasons for raising support are to reward good stewardship or to not allow the depreciation of services resulting from the lack of sufficient funding to provide the public good. I can think of no other institution that has provided such extensive preservation of information and access to knowledge as a public good. Successful advocacy programs grounded in evidence of how the library adds value to these various educational impact indicators are ones that will have audiences of influential people who care about the results. The next challenge we face is how to gather data and use them for evidence-based advocacy efforts. So let me next respond to our host's second question posed to me. So with a focus on the importance or impact of the library on student success, what are some methods to calculate the importance, and how do data form a basis for academic library advocacy? Strategy is important to build advocacy. A common story to tell is building advocacy for the library is to address the impact of the library on student success. To do so, I began to pursue a challenging strategy to gather data for evidence of the library's contribution to student success framed around testing a null hypothesis. In essence, the hypothesis states that there is no significant difference in student success between students who have engaged with the library and those who have not. So if you know the null, hopefully it's not going to be true. Two groups of variables are defined to address this hypothesis. First, we turn to institutional assessment specialists to identify what are student success metrics. We learned that at Drexel, along with many other United States institutions of higher education, typically use retention, grade point average, and years to graduation as standard measures of student academic success. We then identified measurable engagements with the library. These include, for example, the number of entries into the library space per year, the number of encounters with experts, such as the count of reference consultations by time spent, the use of guides librarians prepare per class, or the number of information items provided by the library as loans or downloads. The measurements of engagement resemble the inputs or outputs tracked earlier, except now they form a ratio to place the activity count in a context that relates to the stakeholder. The engagement is not just a count of guides librarians prepare, for example, but rather the number used per class. The challenges we have in capturing these data are many. Different units within the university may hold the source of data. For example, the security department maintains data on entry into the library, but the associated personal identification of the entrant is held in the library circulation system. Privacy regulations prohibit use of information that identifies what a person consults, and some professional ethics extend this to the location where information is consulted. I was able to engage the institutional research staff on our campus to massage the data and run correlations to determine if there was any relationship between entry into the library facility and retention. Applying appropriate statistical tests and controlling for various other factors, they reported results that entry into library space positively explained the difference in retention by 17%. This is high compared to other facilities on campus. So I've used this in advocating for increasing the amount of space characterized as the library's informal learning environments. Library impact on education was first examined with assessment of information literacy instruction. There is a fairly extensive literature that looks at the development of library instruction attendance, use of services, and duration of time students study. However, the work to determine their impact is weak without good measures of learning outcomes. One measure of learning outcomes we tried to study has been information literacy skills. Attempts to use a test of information literacy created by a very respectable education testing company were unsuccessful. We had hoped to correlate the results of evaluating the mastery of skills with engagement with the library. However, the test was awkward, it was too long, and it was not effective. Some methodologies that depend perhaps on faculty assessments of student writing samples and guides them seems most promising in trying to tell the story of how the library programs and resources contribute to student learning. Another area of emerging advocacy is to address library space. A still nascent topic of research is the relationship between physical environments and learning behaviors. Educators, psychologists, designers, planners, architects, and librarians have depended mostly on observations or self-reported impressions of benefits in study space factors and their impact on learning. I've been encouraged by the interest among some diverse stakeholders to gather quantitative data on the relationship in hopes of finding positive impact and develop some new forms of advocacy for library space designs and construction. Researchers at the University of Washington reviewed the literature on evaluating the relation of space to learning and advised that surrogate indicators of learning are learning behaviors. Scott Bennett extended these as indicators of what's known as active learning, among several other factors that he incorporated in survey research about utilization of library spaces. It no longer is enough for the librarians to advocate for more or improved real estate simply on the basis of available square footage, which are inputs, or occupancy, which are outputs. But rather they try to link the library as a place to informal learning behaviors, and as suggested earlier, to other academic success indicators such as retention. So I will highlight a few examples of my own attempts to build evidence advocacy for library support to positively impact student success. Strategies were grounded in the following two value propositions about ways the libraries helps the academy prepare students for success in the information and data age. First, library space, intentionally designed as informal learning environments, enables students to become self-directed, lifelong learners. And they will therefore being well prepared for the workforce or further education after graduation. And secondly, investment in cost-effective ways to ensure access to information resources will help contain student costs for university education. I will highlight use of 4 data gathering methodologies in building evidence about the importance of library engagement on student success. These will include cost analysis, observation, email surveys, and interviews. So let's look separately at use of these methods in attempts to assess the importance of a library space and collection building in their contribution to students becoming lifelong learners and containing their costs for university education. With high concern for the students' well-being, the library's advocacy group, it is an advocacy group, but our advisory group, which consists of faculty and students, repeatedly urge us, the Drexel libraries, to place highest priority on use of library space. This reflects long traditions of people's value of the library as a place, first and foremost. Over the past 6 years, we have conducted numerous studies to gather data on perceived value of space related to learning. Data gathering methodologies have included the following. Some examples. So staff observations and tally of occupied seats during randomly selected times. The ratio of occupied to total number of available seats serves as a metric of occupancy as a surrogate measure of the value placed on using the library space. This and exit counts offer university administrators a trend over time to see that the library continually is heavily used, though of course it provides no insight by itself to how such use relates to learning or student perceived value. Another, collaborating with an architect, Michael Johnson, I was successful in receiving a small prize to study the relationship of space and learning. We identified that there were no methodologies for gathering relevant quantitative data, since most studies rely on self-reported impressions of the contribution studying in a library space has on one's grades or retention. We used old cell phones as cameras to create an inexpensive tool to capture over time video images of activity in selected library spaces. My colleague developed a protocol to process the images into pixel maps that then were analyzed to create a visual representation of what we associated with group and individual learning activities. Though in its very initial stages, this ProxMap, as we called it, procedure, has been received with interest from stakeholders among planners, architects, and designers who are looking for a comparable metric of study behaviors over time and across different space configurations. They value such evidence in advocating for space renovations to affect student learning. Students were asked in another study to record impressions of what were good learning spaces by visiting all the public buildings on campus and taking photographs with their cell phones of any qualified environment. They then posted these with a short description of what about the space was especially good or bad for learning. Reviewing the results offered us visual patterns that helped us understand features valued by our students. Proximity to food, collaborative arrangements, privacy, lack of distractions, and natural light were among the features. My evaluation of the images suggested very low expectations for aesthetic features or even technologies that I and other non-students thought might be more important. But these were useful results that were added to another data gathering exercise involving the use of a rubric by a group of both students and staff from various different academic support centers. They also visited specific learning environments designed for supportive writing, math, and language, as well as information use in libraries. The rubric gave rating categories for levels of perceived effectiveness in supporting active learning, self-directed learning. The university president received the summary report of these data gathering efforts and commented not only on the thoughtful advocacy to improve some specific areas, but also with appreciation that we included opinions from a diverse group of clients and especially the students. We also utilized standard survey and interview techniques to seek student opinion about specific space designs. We held 2 open sessions, for example, to seek the reactions to plans for building an innovative space that allowed students to take ownership of the layout of furniture. The 2 quasi-group interviews were surprisingly well attended by over 200 students. After building this library learning terrace, we emailed a survey to those entering it over the 3 months to ask for ratings of how well the space enables a set of active learning behaviors. Responses were very good, and students rated the space highly for all types of active learning behaviors, such as working alone, working in groups, working in the company of others, with exposure to diverse perspectives, and the like. The only exception was the perception of not having access to experts. That feedback was evidence for advocating for greater library presence and collaborative programs with our other coaches on campus. In preparation for issuing a contract to plan the renovation of our main library, we employed an architect to conduct focus group interviews to help prepare a shared vision of the future library. He used a number of exercises. Numerous students voiced a common characteristics during these discussions, that the most valued quality requested in the library was for space that encourages focused learning. This too was included in advocating for our library renovation. It's not a type of space you find everywhere. So now let's consider the impact of library on the cost of higher education. Traditionally, academic libraries have showed their value in terms of their collection with measures of size and coverage. Measures of a library's activities to build collections was the required metric for many institutional and program accreditations. When access to information was governed by location of the physical publication, ownership of collections was a competitive advantage among institutions of higher education. Advocates for libraries rely on the metrics used for accreditation: number of volumes or titles held, dollars expended for collections, staff, and even square feet of space available over hours open. The basic story was that the more the better. The very high cost of higher education, at least in the United States, has become a source of voiced concern among parents and funding agencies in the past few years. Academic libraries cannot improve college students' lives if people cannot afford to continue their education by enrolling in college or university. At Drexel, librarians have recognized that the one prominent service they offer is access to authoritative information resources, and they do so with traditional collection building, complemented by various circulation services. Decades ago, decisions were made at Drexel to invest the funds traditionally set in the budget for acquiring print books and journals to instead provide convenient access through licensing electronic resources. Today, over 95% of our funds expended for building collections is spent on licenses. To build advocacy for continued support of this important library service, we compared the library's cost to provide access to information sources with the average prices of alternative methods to obtain information for people who are not affiliated with the university. I calculated this return on investment for ensuring authoritative information access based on a ratio of the number of downloads, circulations, and interlibrary loans over a year, divided by the total expenditure for these services, including license costs, prorated staff costs, and equipment infrastructure. The average per item cost to access an information resource managed by the Drexel Libraries is below $3, while obtaining the equivalent access elsewhere would be closer to $30. This reflects a roughly estimated 10-fold positive return on the university's $7 million investment in the library's management of access to information resources for student and faculty. In other words, if the university's community would obtain an equivalent amount of electronic downloads or loans elsewhere, we estimate the cost would be 10 times as high. This offers powerful evidence to build advocacy for maintaining and possibly raising the library's acquisition budget to lower the alternative, more costly options for students to have materials to read and consult. Advocacy starts with the story that matters. So different situations call for different strategies for developing an advocacy for change. Armed with understanding of stakeholders and evidence of impact on how a change has helped improve the lives of others, an advocacy story may be designed. I recently researched the history of the library at Drexel to prepare a chapter for a book that celebrated our university's 125th anniversary. The institution has evolved from a non-degree granting institute of art, science, and industry in the 19th century to becoming a university in 1970. Today, its strategic ambitions include becoming a comprehensive interdisciplinary research university with global impact to solve societal problems while continuing to provide a highly recognized experiential learning education. The library was founded the year the university began operations in 1892 in its original main building. The subsequent expansion of constructing 2 dedicated library buildings over its history seemingly paralleled substantial growth in student population. However, relevant here was the uncovered evidence, in doing this chapter, of advocacy that successfully resulted in physical expansion of the library. In both cases, and in spite of former directors lobbying for increased funding for collection building, as well as improved added spaces for students to study, each capital expansion followed challenges by accreditation agencies that questioned if there was capacity to support university-level curricula. Inputs were the metrics useful for library advocacy as they impacted the institution's strategic efforts to mature as a university. Another 3 decades later, and the need for space to house physical collections was waning in light of changes in information online availability and information-seeking behaviors. The story of what difference the library makes to the success of the university must change, and librarians will benefit from having an open-minded and a flexible approach to identify relevant evidence-based advocacy. Successful advocacy starts with the stories that matter most to both the advocators and those benefiting from the results changing that they would promote. So my comments this morning explored questions around how impact indicators can help build advocacy. Library practitioners do not typically consider metrics for the purpose of advocacy. The exploration concludes with 5 observations to keep in mind as these new directions are pursued. 1, advocacy is a situational activity. 2nd, advocacy bridges interests of people with influence and outcomes affecting people at risk. 3rd, positive change through advocacy requires engagement of multiple stakeholders. 4, the impact indicators offer common ground for tracking progress to reach the desired change. And 5, impact factors tell the story through concise, intentional talking points. Opportunities for librarians and other stakeholders to focus on telling the stories of the value of libraries are emerging. The best ones relate to the library's institutional mission and strategic objectives. New areas to consider include the impact on assisting learners to be independent, knowledgeable, and confident in navigating information resources, as well as data, the impact of preserving sources for future research and scholarship, and the impact on containing affordability of higher education. I won't try to say this in French, but thank you very much for your patience and interest in my comments. So I think now we are open for
Des questions? Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français, elles seront traduites à Danuta.
Est-ce que l'advocacy est enseignée en fait aux étudiants bibliothécaires aux États-Unis? Est-ce que c'est voilà, une discipline au même titre que la politique documentaire?
That's an interesting question. I would say that in the programs that I'm familiar with in the United States, not as a separate course. I had, a few years ago, I taught a course about academic librarianship and was focusing a lot more on managerial challenges, and in that context tried to raise the fact that we just need to communicate our story better. The ideas now that you challenged me to think about, bring up, of using evidence in that, I think is still relatively new.
À vous écouter, en fait, on a l'impression qu'effectivement, il est nécessaire de plaider pour la bibliothèque, mais en même temps, le nombre d'études dont vous faites état montre qu'au au bout du compte, vous avez une écoute et que la direction de l'université ou le conseil d'administration de l'université tient compte des résultats de vos études et tire parti en fait de ces résultats pour orienter soit le budget, soit l'aménagement de la bibliothèque. Donc est-ce que finalement cette écoute, elle est positive et elle est inscrite dans les échanges avec votre tutelle? Est-ce que c'est quelque chose de spécifique à votre université ou est-ce que l'ensemble des universités ont une écoute bienveillante comme ça pour les directeurs de bibliothèques universitaires?
Mm-hmm. I think that really varies with the university. So maybe a few words about Drexel and a little bit about my past. So prior to coming to Drexel, I worked in 4 or 5 very, very large research libraries. And in fact, I see a Yale sticker there. That's where I came from before going to Drexel. For 15 years I was there. And there, it wasn't, the value of the library was almost not challenged. I walked for 15 years under a doorway, chiseled in stone, literally, was the library is the heart of the university. Metrics such as the price for getting our collections, the number of staff to deal with all the people is important. I came to Drexel, and I think Drexel is not considered one of the large research libraries. And it is a strappy kind of place, you know, trying to figure out different ways of gaining success. The president there before me, actually in a very well-known, the Wall Street Journal, very well newspaper, had in an interview said he wasn't going to increase library budgets for building buildings and collections. And that created a cultural expectation in my institute when I arrived that do we really even need a library? So trying to figure out how to influence the influential people to understand or to take things. So it is, my institution is a STEM. It's very heavily engineering, business, people who work in metrics. And so we're trying to incorporate that in. And I'd say it's mixed. The first time I did it, as I said, you used what every major library would do a comparison to your peers. And I had no problem showing how we were below most peers. And as I said, the reaction was, well, see, you do it better, so we don't need to use that. Now, when we're starting to talk about how it affects the ambitions of the university, how does it help the retention, the years to graduation, the success of the student, they do look for these other activities, and they see it's mixed, but I'd say at least my boss, the provost, is beginning to take interest in that. I don't know, I haven't heard how many, throughout our country, and there's a lot of value judging, you've probably seen publications, and trying to understand how do we make that story. How effective it is in getting change is varied still. Good question, though.
Merci Danuta.
Well, thank you very much.